Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Fernando Reimers. Thank you so much for coming. That was a great beginning this morning, wasn't it? I loved the last conversation that we had. My goal this morning is to talk about the challenges and the opportunities to connect research-based knowledge with policy and practice. When we think about the question of whether children are in fact learning what they need in schools, the answer for many of them is no, they're not. Humanity has seen tremendous success since the right to education was included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947 until today. But it hasn't seen the same success in ensuring that that opportunity actually translates into meaningful learning opportunities for children. And what I want to describe is a collaborative effort which I lead, the Global Education Innovation Initiative, that begins with the premise that one of the ways to articulate successful partnerships is to recognize that in any practice, whether it's the practice of a teacher or a school principal or an administrator or a minister, there is a process of knowledge creation. And if we want to make sure that there is better alignment between research policy and practice, we have to find ways for those conversations to be multiple ways, as opposed to the more conventional research to dissemination viewpoint that says we go from basic science, from basic research, to developing technology that is then disseminated to practitioners. So what we do in the Global Education Innovation Initiative is to try to understand how it is that education leaders and practitioners in a range of countries define and practice an education that is relevant to the needs of the 21st century. And we do that through three very simple activities. The first one is we conduct applied research. And this morning I'm going to spend more time sharing with you the findings of our latest study. But we have, in essence, conducted three applied studies of that kind. We also promote dialogues, convenings that bring together individuals that have leadership responsibilities in institutions that together conform an education ecosystem in particular jurisdictions, a city, a state, or a nation. And we use those convenings to also generate knowledge about what is it that needs to change in those contexts to have more effective, more robust opportunities for children to learn what they need in the 21st century. And the last set of activities that we do is we develop, in collaboration with practitioners, with teachers in this case, simple practical tools, curriculum, that can help teachers figure out what should I do differently on Monday morning to provide my students with opportunities that help them build the capacities they will need to become architects of their own lives. So we work only in a subset of countries around the world. It's a choice of convenience. It includes countries that are large for the most part, and where we have partners like Claudia Ramos, who was with us this morning, who's the director of a think tank in Brazil. In all the other countries, we have similar partnerships with colleagues who have both the capacity to conduct research as well as the desire and the capacity to influence policy and practice. So an example of and we've been working for the last 5 years. And so on the applied research side, we have conducted 3 studies. The first one built on a synthesis developed by the National Research Council in the United States on what are the capacities, the human capacities that help people live good lives. And we used that synthesis to develop a taxonomy, which we then employed to examine the national curriculum standards, curriculum frameworks of a range of countries. And we wrote a series of case studies that answer how come the countries that we studied got to change the curriculum to include the goals that they did. And I won't be describing that study today. I'll be instead talking about our second follow-on study. One of the conclusions of that study was that as countries have expanded their aspirations for what it is that students should learn in school, the topic of teacher education, of teacher capacities, becomes the linchpin to whether we can enact a 21st century education or not. So unlike 3-4 decades ago, where there was some contention as to whether teacher education was a promising lever for educational reform, there is no longer contention about that issue. The only question is, how do we do that? And I want to spend some time at the end of my presentation sharing what we have learned about that. And the last study is a study conducted in this region. It's the result of an empirical evaluation, a randomized controlled trial that examined the impact of the program Injaz Al-Arab in helping students in high school develop entrepreneurial skills. And that book was just published at the end of last year. On the second set of things that we conduct is informed dialogues. The notion of an informed dialogue stems from a very simple discovery, which I made 30 years ago. And the discovery is that books don't read themselves. And if your goal in writing books is to actually influence how people think and act, you have to do more than write books. You have to first ask what is it that people are interested in, and you have to orchestrate conversations where their interests shape the research questions and contribute to a process that is an iterative process that goes from questions based on practice to generating that knowledge. And the three books that are here are the results of various kinds of learning expeditions, let's call them that way, that we organize. The first one focused on Massachusetts, bringing together education leaders in Massachusetts to help us think differently about how we prepare our teachers. The second one is a result of a convening of 50 leaders of education organizations, both in government and in civil society, dealing with the question of what are the barriers to scaling more promising, more progressive education practices, and what might we do to overcome those barriers. That's the book, Empowering Students at Scale. And the most recent one is a book, I'll be saying a few words about that, just published a few weeks ago, which is a result of the work of 10 former ministers of education or high-level leaders of system change, reflecting on what they had learned in their own process of leading attempts to bring about ambitious education reforms. And that book has recently been published, and I'll be saying a few words about that at the end. So these are three examples of informed dialogues. And lastly, we also produce curriculum materials. These are three books that present an entire curriculum from kindergarten to high school, aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll say a word about how these materials are being used to animate communities of practice in various countries in supporting a demonstration of 21st century pedagogy. So let me go to our study. This is a study that we conducted over a 2-year period. What we did was very simple. We set out to understand what it was that organizations that were running programs on which there was evidence that they were actually helping teachers build the capacity to educate the whole child. We set out to answer the question of what exactly do they do? How do they do it? And then to compare across organizations, what do they have in common? The reason this study is important is because when you look at the existing literature on teaching education, there are some puzzles. On the one hand, there is increasing evidence that teacher quality matters to student learning outcomes. Second, there is limited evidence that the existing forms of professional development produce much change in teacher practices or in student learning. Third, most of that evidence is focused on a rather narrow range of student learning outcomes, mostly academic outcomes in language, mathematics, and science to some extent. And then lastly, teachers receive, as documented in the Tally study of PISA, inordinate amounts of teacher professional development, very large amounts of teacher PD, reflecting the growing consensus that it matters. And they're actually quite happy with it. But at the same time, the same studies where principals are asked what are some of the biggest barriers to educational quality improvements, they will say teacher capacities. So how do we make sense of the fact that we know that teacher quality matters, that we don't have a lot of evidence that PD actually is influencing practice, that we're doing a lot of PD, but it doesn't seem to matter? A possible hypothesis is that maybe we call PD things that really are not developing anyone very much. And to some extent, this is what this study concludes. So these are the sites that we studied. One is an inquiry-based science education program in Chile. Another one is a program in China that looks at how an entire district promotes pedagogical innovation. Another one is a program largely of citizenship education, Escuela Activa Urbana in Colombia. Another one is a program to develop the capacity of teachers to cultivate life skills among their students, Dream a Dream in India. Another one is a program in Mexico which began as an attempt to introduce technology in schools, but which quickly evolved in a program that used technology to help teachers teach more coherently across subjects and grades in schools, UNETE. In the US, a program that began 3 decades ago as an attempt to simultaneously develop character and academic skills on the part of students, expeditionary learning. And lastly, a program of principal development in Singapore. When we finish the case studies, I wrestle a lot with what to title this book, because what surprised me is that programs that were on the surface very differently. What does a science education program have in common with a program to cultivate the capacities of principals in Singapore with a program to develop civic capacities? When you look beneath the surface, when you open the first page of the book, what you realize is the striking similarities across these programs on a range of domains. But at the same time, you realize that most of what is characterized as teacher professional development in surveys such as TALIS actually doesn't look like these programs at all. So I thought maybe we shouldn't call these professional development. Maybe we have to invent a new term to differentiate what these programs do with what goes under that rubric. So what are some of those findings? First of all these programs of professional development reflect a conception of adult learning that sees what teachers do as socially situated. Teachers don't just teach in a way that reflects what they know. They teach in a way that reflects what they believe their peers expect them to do, in a way that reflects what they believe their principals expect them to do. And they also have a sense of what it is that they need to learn. And all these programs take that into account. It's so simple. But how many programs do you know that are done very differently? They reflect the conception of what someone outside the school believes the teachers should learn and reflect a more top-down view. And then some of those programs are surprised that teachers don't use what they have gained in these programs. This form of professional development is not at all of the form of a 1, 2, or 3-day workshop, or even 5-day workshop. These programs involve a multiplicity of methodologies, from coaching, peer-to-peer learning, action research on the part of teachers, reading a book, discussing, building professional learning communities, all of them, over an extended period of time, 3 to 5 years, with a lot of people in the school. In other words, these programs are much more about organizational transformation of the school than they are about the cultivation of individual capacities of teachers. These programs see teachers as working within an organizational context, and what they try to do is to change the context, building the capacities and developing shared mindsets and a shared culture among a range of team in the school. So again, very different to what most people call, how many of you are familiar with those cascade training programs in which people are brought in as individuals to these weekend workshops or things of the sort? Third finding, the modalities I've just described that of PD are varied. They're not about a single methodology. It's not about teaching teachers classroom management. It's not about teaching teachers a new method to teach early literacy through decoding. It's all of those things that include developing teachers' most conceptual understanding of why they're doing things, as well as teaching them particular methodologies and particular techniques, but not disembodied from conceptual understanding that would help the teachers decide whether to use new techniques or not. The curriculum of these programs covers, all of them, a blend of capacities. To some extent, not surprisingly, we selected the programs that way. But these are not programs about teaching teachers, pedagogists to do a single thing. These are programs that begin with the assumption that good teaching is about equipping the teacher to develop multiple capacities at the same time. And these programs don't reflect a zero-sum mindset that it's either about literacy or character. On the contrary, these programs see the development of character, for example, as something that happens while you help children learn how to read or learn science or learn mathematics. The curriculum of these programs reflects a view of learning on the part of both students and teachers that includes certainly cognitive skills, but also the skills to know oneself and to manage as oneself, as well as the skills to collaborate with others. These programs, by design, all invoke collaboration and build the capacity of teachers to collaborate. Again, very different from the cascade models that take teachers as individuals and that cultivate them alone, absent their social context. They include a variety of things, from exposure to visible routines, helping them develop lesson plans, as well as more abstract things like discussing new books, new theoretical approaches, things of that sort. These programs rely on a mix of opportunities of learning, 80% of which are situated in schools. So these programs operate, fail to say that, in large units of schools. None of these programs are about working with one school at a time, nor are these programs the modality of the blind leading the blind that is common with schools undertaking their own creation of learning communities. These programs all leverage the benefits of scale in working with a network of schools, at the center of which is an organization that plays the role of a knowledge manager, in a sense. That entity could be an NGO, could be a university, or could be a state institution. In the case of China, it is a normal school. In the case of Colombia, it's an NGO and a university. In the case of Chile, it's a university that plays that. But these programs are about building networks as the infrastructure that supports the professional development. And those networks are very important, and the engagement of civil society organizations is very important, because it is that relative independence from the state that provides these programs some immunity to the inevitable fluxes in priorities that take place in governments under regimes where there is some competition, some political competition. It is the norm rather than the exception that governments will change, and when they change, priorities will change. And the reason Escuela Activa Urbana has been able to build on the success of Escuela Nueva, spanning a total of 5 decades, is because civil society organizations have immunized the program relative to the changes in political priorities of governments, or the same thing with the program in Chile or with the program in Mexico. These organizations build a range of partnerships to enhance the capacity of schools. Again, these programs aren't just about learning communities or professional development communities in schools where teachers are left to their own resources to teach themselves. These programs all augment the capacity of the school by bringing to the school partnerships with other organizations, very often universities. In fact, I think that one of the messages of this book is a message to universities, that they can play a very important role in taking responsibility for the improvement of K-12 education, something, by the way, most universities don't see as their role and don't do. And by playing that role, these programs see teacher practice as situated in a social context, as I've mentioned, and for the most part adopt a whole school approach to transformation as opposed to a single classroom-based or teacher-based approach to change. Interestingly, I often am asked in the context of the Global Initiative, where we're interested in the broader topic of skills for the 21st century, how about measurement? And there are some people who say, until we learn how to measure these things, we'll not make any progress. Well, these programs actually all depend on measurement. But it isn't necessarily of measurement of student learning outcomes to begin with. All these programs know that, for example, when expeditionary learning began to cultivate character as well as academic excellence simultaneously, our measurements of academic skills are a lot more developed in the United States than our measurement of character, for a very simple reason. We've been at it longer. We have spent a century deciding how to measure literacy skills, for example, something we haven't done for civic skills. That did not stop EL from beginning to work in that area. They understand, as many innovators do, that you first have to design the curriculum, the practice, but you also have to build a lot of mechanisms that can guide you, that can provide formative feedback. And many of them often include feedback on what are the teachers actually doing, on teacher practice, feedback on who's coming to these programs and what do the teachers think. So these programs actually all build many opportunities for learning on the part of the organizations leading them. It's just that they don't begin with student learning outcomes, nor do they get paralyzed by the absence of clear and agreed upon measures of student learning outcomes before they actually begin to develop curriculum and pedagogy. All these organizations model a learning orientation. In fact, as we pondered titles that we could give this book, I thought this is a great example of learning organizations to support learning in schools, both the organizations managing that as well as the schools. Part of what they do is build that capacity to continuously learn. So let me just say 2 words about 2 other publications. This book just published, Letters to a New Minister, basically contains a series of reflections produced by people like Claudia Costin, like Jaime Saavedra, who's with us here, like the recent Education Secretary of Mexico and others, who basically took stock of what they tried to do when they were in leadership roles, and who said, what did I learn? What surprised me? What do I wish I had known when I began that job? And again, what we did was to analyze across these reflections, what are the common themes? And similarly to what we did with a similar exercise in Singapore or with another study of education leadership, it is striking how many themes are in common. I will not share with you some of those commonalities, maybe in the Q&A, maybe Claudia will share her own reflections and learnings from that book. And then finally, I just want to say a word about our curriculum development. Part of what is now happening with these resources is that, again, networks of schools, organizations that work with networks of schools, are adopting these resources to then co-create with us their own version. So, for example, last year, I worked with an organization related to the Tony Blair Foundation that does a lot of work on human rights and democratic education in Italy. And we worked with 100 teachers who translated this curriculum and who then developed a version of that curriculum aligned with the Italian national curriculum. Because they said if we do that, it'll be a lot easier for people in our schools to teach that. Similarly, I work with 50 teachers selected by the National Education Association Foundation in the United States, developing a version of that curriculum. And the premise, again, is that the most effective utilization of practices or curriculum or pedagogies is one that involves teachers as co-creators because they know their context, and networks of teachers across schools and across different places. So maybe I should stop here suggesting that the puzzle of how do we help schools make sure that they teach students what they need in the 21st century is a puzzle that can be greatly be solved by the kinds of rational tools that Steven Pinker was talking about this morning. And the name of those tools are educational practice, educational policy, and educational research. But in order for those tools to really yield the benefits that they can yield, it's very important that we think about the relationship between them as a relationship that isn't necessarily from research to policy to practice, but as a relationship that is mutually informed. It's also from practice to policy and to research. So let me stop here and take your comments and your questions. Maybe I can call on you, Claudia, since you're in the audience, and ask you to say a few words about our most recent book, since you are one of our partners, or anything in general that you want to say. Is that okay? Can we give her a microphone?
So, thank you, Professor Reimers, for your presentation. And very briefly, let me tell you where I'm coming from. Yes, I have now a think tank on education. I think it's easier so that you can see me. I have a think tank on education policies in Rio de Janeiro, the most beautiful city in the world, in Brazil. And I've been before Senior Director for Global Education in the World Bank. But what we did with the book, the very interesting book, is how would I recommend or give recommendations to a new minister on the learnings I had as a subnational minister in Brazil. And When I was a subnational minister, I was in the city of Rio de Janeiro, 6 million inhabitants, 1 million students, and a mayor that wanted to change the landscape of the city completely. And there were lots of challenges, one of them being slums, very violent slums dominated by the drug dealers. But we had 155 schools in those slums. And the worst teachers, not because they wanted to be worst, but because they were incipient or initial teachers, were going to those schools, whereas the most proficient teachers were going to the schools in middle-class neighborhoods. So I didn't realize at the time that I have to have a theory of change to convince the mayor. I learned it the hard way, with lots of conversation, that we should pay more the teachers that would be teaching there, and to retain there. And we should have a kind of affirmative action, giving more resources to the schools that needed the most. I succeeded in the end. So just to say that this is one point that I touched there, how to convince mayors or governors or presidents on how to change.
And that's a perfect example of the kind of ideas you will find in this book, in which, I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? Part of what a minister has to do is negotiate with political authorities. Communication is very important. Time after time, each of these 10 chapters emphasizes how much more important communication ended up being than any of them had anticipated. And these were all very accomplished people when they got to the position of ministers. So our hope in publishing that book is that it will make the task a little easier for those who take on the job in the future. Any comments or questions? Yes, please. Can we have a microphone here? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Laura Calventi from Inicia Educación, Dominican Republic. Thank you very much, Professor. I was wondering if this specific study got any findings about what should do a new minister about unions, because of course in Latin America specifically, unions have a very...
Work with them. All of the chapters talk about them. Work with them and understand that education is a task where authority is distributed. I think two messages from this book, which are very important, can be summarized as follows. One of the authors of this chapter says, I was lucky to learn early on that any minister builds on the accomplishments of her predecessor and plants the seeds for what her successor will reap. That long-term view, that understanding, that educational change only happens as a result of long policy cycles, in contrast to the perception that some people have coming into the job that you're going to be able to reinvent the republic in 5 years, is a very important lesson. The second theme that all of them recognize is I realize how limited power a minister had, how power in fact was distributed among a range of stakeholders, and that if I was to be effective, I would have, I guess the way I would summarize it was with the words of the famous Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who said 26 centuries ago that a good leader is the person who discovers that they work with others and engage others in accomplishing a task, and when the task is actually done, everybody says, we did it ourselves. That notion of leadership as distributed leadership is another one of the takeaways. So work with them is the short answer to your question. Yes?
Chris Ryan from New Brunswick, Canada. I'm wondering, when you talked about those 10 education institutes, how were they partnering with the universities? What kind of supports were they getting from the universities or the NGOs that they were working with? It's a great question. So some of them are parts of universities. The institutes that are part of the initiative or that we studied, because both of them involve universities. Oh, the ones that we studied. So take, for example, Chile.
The program in Chile was launched by the Faculty of Sciences and by a professor who's a national winner of a National Science Prize, and who begins with the theory that it is impossible, he would have resonated with Steve Pinker's ideas. It is impossible to be a citizen in the 21st century if you cannot think the way a scientist does. And he would have resonated with Claudia's idea because he said, and the opportunity to learn to think like a scientist is denied to children who live in the communities we were just describing. So we said, we are going to bring our doctoral students, our graduate students in the sciences to work side by side with teachers in helping teachers not transmit content, scientific content, but teaching the habits of mind, which many teachers themselves have not acquired because they haven't had the benefit, the opportunity to be educated to think like scientists. So in that case, you had a faculty of sciences saying, we want to work with the educators in the schools in building the capacities among the teachers to use new pedagogies, basically engage the students in conducting experiments is what they were doing. And I would say that of the organizations that we studied, at least a third of those involved universities, and others involve NGOs or NGOs and universities. I guess the real question is, why did the universities do that? Because it isn't in the natural order of things for many people in the university community to think that it is their responsibility to improve schools. And I guess in all of these cases, there were examples of exceptional leadership on the part of individuals, like this National Science Prize winner in Chile, or leaders of the university who thought it was their responsibility to do that. I mean, if you think about what Claudia has built in the context of a university, it has taken her own entrepreneurship and leadership and the use of her own capital to persuade the university that they should invest in creating a place in the university that is committed to the improvement of public education. A more conventional path would have been for her to go to an existing school of education and to theorize, contemplate the problems of education, not necessarily to get their hands involved in working alongside with practitioners. You had a question.
Good morning. Thank you so much. My name is Sunita and I'm from India.
And yours will be the last question. Yeah.
Okay. And India is one of the countries that
Yes.
has been covered in one of your studies.
Yes.
And India, as most of you know, is a land of extreme diversities. And
It's a land of what?
Diversities and
Yes.
extreme complexities. There have been a lot of innovations when it comes to the professional development of teachers.
Yes.
My question is that, when you look at the numbers that we are dealing in India, do you have any reflections to share that, how do we really take these innovations to scale when it comes to the professional development?
I do
of
have a
teachers?
reflection.
Because we have been dealing with 15 million teachers actually.
Yes, I do have a reflection. I agree that the scale of India is such that it might be more reasonable to attempt a kind of coherent change if one thinks about it at a provincial level or even a smaller scale within a province. But I do have a sense that, and I also agree that there are many organizations, mostly in civil society, that are generating enormous innovation. Our partner in India is the Kaivala Education Foundation. You may know them. They run the Gandhi Fellows program. They are, with other organizations, examples of organizations that are absolutely committed to producing transformed pedagogy and curriculum. I think there is a great opportunity in India, as there is in others, in building the collective leadership that is essential to take all this knowledge, all this wisdom accumulated by organizations like Kaivala, and turning that into a shared consciousness in the country that actually permeates the way governments think, and that becomes the norm, that becomes a new educational culture. I think that we're living at an interesting time in many societies, not just in India, where you have, in effect, civil society is to some extent ahead of governments. They're more flexible, they have more capacity to innovate and so on. But many of these efforts in many places are fragmented. So fragmented that everyone is looking at their own silo. And that is, I think, one of the answers to your good question. It is very difficult to scale when you're only minding your own business, and your own business is by necessity slow. You can only scale if you join forces with others who are also minding their own business, and together you actually develop some shared ideas about what should be happening in professional development. One of the products of the initiative that we developed in partnership with the Varkey Education Foundation was a very simple protocol. It's a publication that has only 15 pages. The title is Connecting the Dots, 13 Steps to the Improvement of Teaching and Learning. You can find it online, and it's a protocol. We put together one of these think tanks that involve ministers of education, leaders of teacher unions, deans of schools of education, university presidents, exceptional teachers, some of the finalists of the Teacher Prize. And we spent a year saying, what is a simple thing we could do? What is a simple protocol we could produce that would help people interested in improving education know what steps to follow? And so that is available. My suggestion would be, one of the things that could be happen in India is take that protocol, convene 50 people around the table and say, why don't we do that at least for one province? With that, I must end because we have another session beginning just now. But thank you very much for your interest in education, for what you do, and for coming this morning.